Hey everyone! This is a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button. It lets me know that you are enjoying my content. Also, feel free to drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. The grime under my fingernails seems permanently etched there, a testament to the life I lead. It's not exactly glamorous, hauling trash for the city, but it pays the bills, and frankly, I'm better at this than anything else I've ever tried. School was a disaster. I could never focus, the words swimming on the page like tadpoles in a murky pond. But give me something physical, a task to complete, and I'm a different person. I can work circles around most people, man or woman. And that's how I ended up here, behind the wheel of a sanitation truck, navigating the labyrinthine streets of this city. It's not exactly a career path I envisioned for myself. When I was a kid, I dreamed of being a park ranger, spending my days surrounded by nature, not garbage. But life has a funny way of laughing at your plans. Turns out I'm allergic to most plants, and paperwork is definitely not my forte. So here I am, the rare female sanitation worker, navigating the urban jungle instead of a real one. And let me tell you, this concrete jungle is a beast all its own. Most of the guys I work with are, well, they're guys. Rough around the edges, mostly, with a shared love of greasy food and loud music. They tolerate me, more or less. I keep to myself, do my job, and try not to get involved in their locker room banter. It's easier that way. I've learned to tune out the cat calls and the occasional, "Hey, sweetheart, you lost?" It comes with the territory. Being a woman in this line of work is like being a zebra in a herd of horses. You stick out. Recently they transferred me to a new route, the suburbs. It's a step down if you ask me. Less money, more driving. And this particular area, it's got a reputation. Sketchy, they call it. The kind of place where streetlights flicker and shadows seem to have a life of their own. I've heard stories, whispers about things that go bump in the night, but I've learned not to pay them too much mind. Every neighborhood has its ghost stories. This whole thing started with the truck. My old truck, Betsy, bless her rusty heart, finally gave up the ghost. Transmission trouble, the mechanic said. Too expensive to fix. So I got a new one. Well, new to me. It's a hulking beast of a machine, twice the size of Betsy, with a growl that could wake the dead. It was driven by a guy named, well, I don't actually know his name. Nobody does, really. He just disappeared, vanished. Poof. One morning, the truck was found abandoned on Elm Street, engine still running, doors wide open, like he just stepped out for a smoke. But he was gone. No note, no sign of a struggle, just gone. The cops did their thing, asked around, but nobody saw anything. It's like he'd been swallowed by the city itself. They gave me his truck, said it was the only one available. I didn't argue. A job's a job. But climbing into the cab for the first time, I felt a chill run down my spine. It still smelled like him. A mix of cheap cologne and something vaguely metallic, like, I don't know, like old pennies. His stuff was still inside. A half-eaten sandwich in a greasy wrapper, a thermos full of lukewarm coffee, a crumpled pack of cigarettes, and a notebook. It was tucked under the seat, bound in worn leather, the pages filled with scribbled handwriting. I almost tossed it, figured it was just some guy's grocery lists or whatever. But something about it caught my eye. I opened it up. It wasn't grocery lists. It was a diary. At first it was mundane stuff, the usual garbage collector's ramblings. Tuesday, overflowing bins on Maple Street. Stray dog tried to bite me. Need new gloves. That kind of thing. Boring, but harmless. But as I kept reading, the entries started to change. The tone shifted. He started writing about things he'd seen, things that didn't make sense. A trash bag that moved on its own. A shadow that seemed to follow him down certain streets. He wrote about a house on Pine Street, number 237, and how he got a really bad feeling when he went there. He didn't say what happened at the house, just that he never wanted to go back. The last few entries were disturbing. He was clearly terrified. He wrote about hearing noises at night, knocking sounds that seemed to come from inside the truck itself. He talked about feeling like he was being watched, like something was out there, just on the edge of his vision, always watching. The last entry was the worst. It was scrawled in shaky handwriting, the ink smudged, like he'd written it in a hurry. It said simply, "I saw someone driving my truck last night. It wasn't me." I closed the diary, my hands trembling. I wanted to dismiss it, as the ramblings of a crazy man, someone who'd lost his grip on reality. But a small, nagging voice in the back of my head told me otherwise. There was something about the way he wrote, the raw fear that bled through the words, that made me believe him, or at least made me believe that he believed what he was writing. I put the diary back under the seat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around the cab, half expecting to see someone there, lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the worn interior of the truck, the smell of old coffee, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I started the engine, the truck roaring to life. I pulled out onto the street, beginning my route. As I drove, I couldn't help but think about the missing driver, about the diary, about the strange things he'd written. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted, and I had a feeling that it was about to grow. The city was just waking up as I started my route. The sky was that pre-dawn gray, the kind that makes everything look a little bit sinister. Streetlights flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and contorted with every gust of wind. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. The diary entries kept replaying in my head, the man's fear palpable even through the worn pages. I saw someone driving my truck last night. It wasn't me. The words echoed in my mind, a chilling premonition. I tried to focus on the job, on the rhythm of the route. Stop, empty, drive. Stop, empty, drive. It's a monotonous routine, but usually it's a mindless one. A way to zone out and let my thoughts wander. But today my thoughts were trapped in a loop of dread. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the truck, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept glancing in my side mirror, half expecting to see something, someone, there, lurking in the shadows. Then I saw it. It was just a trash bag, sitting on the curb like hundreds of others. But this one was different. It was huge, for one thing, practically overflowing, and it was moving. Not a violent, thrashing movement, but a slow, subtle shifting, like something was alive inside. My heart hammered against my ribs. I remembered the diary, the man's warnings about moving bags. Never open a moving bag. That was the first rule, the unspoken commandment of this job. I told myself to keep driving, just ignore it. It's probably just the wind, or some animal rummaging through the trash. But I couldn't. I just couldn't. There was something about that bag, something that pulled at me, a morbid curiosity that I couldn't resist. It was like a car accident. You know you shouldn't look, but you can't help yourself. I pulled the truck over, my hands shaking. I grabbed my gloves, the thick rubber ones that are supposed to protect you from everything. But they felt flimsy now, useless against whatever might be lurking inside that bag. I approached it cautiously, my boots crunching on the gravel. The bag shifted again, a slow, deliberate movement that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the top of the bag. I knew I shouldn't do this. I knew it was a mistake. But the compulsion was too strong. I had to know. I ripped the bag open. Inside it wasn't garbage, it was a body, folded and twisted, the bones snapped at unnatural angles. But the worst part was the face. It was my face. Or not exactly my face. It was a grotesque imitation, a distorted version of my own features. The skin was pale and waxy, the eyes wide and unblinking. And then, it blinked. The eyelids fluttered open and shut, mimicking my own blinking. The mouth opened and closed, mimicking my breathing. It was like looking into a twisted mirror, a reflection from some nightmare dimension. I screamed, a raw animal sound that ripped through the morning quiet. I stumbled backward, tripping over a discarded tire, and fell heavily to the ground. The thing in the bag just stared at me, its eyes locked on mine. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me. Back to the truck, back to the illusion of safety. I jumped into the cab, slamming the door shut. I didn't even bother to empty the rest of the bins on the street. I just put the truck in gear and sped away, leaving the bag and its horrifying contents behind. I didn't stop until I reached the depot. I parked the truck, my hands still shaking, and ran inside. I told my boss I wasn't feeling well, that I needed to go home. He didn't argue. He just looked at me, a strange expression on his face, and told me to take the rest of the day off. I went home and locked myself in my apartment. I couldn't shake the image of the thing in the bag. Its eyes, its face, its movements, it was burned into my brain. I tried to tell myself it was just a hallucination, a product of my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew it was real. The next day, I almost called in sick. I couldn't face going back to that route, back to the possibility of seeing that bag again. But I needed the money. And besides, a small part of me, a morbid, twisted part, wanted to know, wanted to see if it was still there. I went back to work, my hands clammy, my stomach in knots. I drove my route, my eyes constantly scanning the streets, searching for the bag. But it wasn't there. I told myself I was relieved, that it was over. But I was wrong. As I was driving down Elm Street, the same street where the other driver's truck was found abandoned, I saw it. Not the bag. Something worse. Standing on the sidewalk under a flickering streetlight was the thing. The doppelganger. It was just standing there, perfectly still, staring directly at me. It looked exactly like me, but different, more sinister. Its eyes were cold and empty, its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. The truck skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the asphalt. I stared at the doppelganger, frozen with fear. It didn't move, it just kept staring at me, its eyes boring into my soul. I blinked, and it was gone. Just like that. Vanished. I looked around frantically, searching for it, but it was nowhere to be seen. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it real? Or was I finally losing my mind? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear that had enveloped me. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen, and I knew that whatever it was coming for me. The doppelganger's image was seared into my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its cold, empty stare, its grotesque smile. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just stress, exhaustion, anything but what it clearly was. Something unnatural, something terrifying. But the more I tried to deny it, the more the fear gnawed at me. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I knew I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. I went back to work the next day, but I was a wreck. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes darted nervously around, searching for... I didn't even know what. The doppelganger? The moving bag? Something worse? I felt like I was being hunted, like invisible eyes were watching me from every shadow. The route was the same, the streets were the same, but everything felt different. The familiar landscape had become alien, hostile. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps, every creak of the truck like a whispered threat. I jumped at every sudden noise, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then I started hearing the knocking. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against the side of the truck. I thought it was just road noise, the rumble of the engine, the rattling of the garbage in the back. But it kept happening, again and again, a persistent, unsettling rhythm that burrowed into my brain. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but the knocking grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around me, sometimes above me, sometimes below, sometimes from the sides of the truck. I couldn't pinpoint the source, which only made it more terrifying. It was like the sound was alive, moving around me, playing a macabre game of hide-and-seek. I checked my mirrors constantly, searching for the source of the knocking, but there was nothing. Just the empty streets, the silent houses, the mocking shadows. The knocking continued, a relentless pulse that echoed in my skull. Tap, tap, tap. It was driving me crazy. I pulled the truck over, my hands trembling. I shut off the engine, hoping the silence would make the knocking stop, but it didn't. It was still there, even louder now, a steady, rhythmic beat that seemed to be coming from inside the truck itself. I held my breath, listening intently. The knocking was definitely inside the truck, somewhere close. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, through the steering wheel. It was like something was trapped inside the truck with me, trying to get out. I slowly reached for the door handle, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't open the door. I knew it was a trap, but I couldn't stand the suspense any longer. I had to know what was making that sound. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open. Nothing. The truck was empty. Just the worn seats, the dusty dashboard, the familiar smell of old coffee and metal. The knocking had stopped. I sat there for a moment, listening to the silence, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself. Maybe I was just hearing things. I started the engine again, my hands still shaking. I pulled back onto the road, trying to put the knocking out of my mind. But it was no use. It was still there, lurking in the background, a constant, unsettling presence. As I continued my route, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. It was like it was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me about something. But I couldn't understand what it was. I just knew that it was something bad. I finished my route, my nerves completely frayed. I drove back to the depot, parked the truck, and went inside. I told my boss I was feeling sick again, that I needed to go home. He didn't argue. He just looked at me, that same strange expression on his face, and told me to take the rest of the day off. I went home and locked myself in my apartment, just like the day before. I tried to distract myself, to watch TV, to read a book, but I couldn't concentrate. The knocking was still there, echoing in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, creaks, and groans, imagining that the knocking was getting closer, that it was coming from inside my apartment. I tossed and turned, my mind racing, my heart pounding. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The next morning, I almost called in sick. I couldn't face going back to that truck, back to the knocking, back to the fear. But I knew I had to. I needed the money. And besides, a part of me, a morbid, twisted part, wanted to know, wanted to see what would happen next. I went back to work, my body trembling, my stomach in knots. I drove my route, my eyes constantly scanning the streets, searching for, I didn't know what, the doppelganger? The moving bag? The source of the knocking? The knocking started again, almost immediately. It was louder now, more insistent, a constant, rhythmic pounding that echoed through the truck. Tap, tap, tap. It was driving me insane. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but it was impossible. The knocking was everywhere, all around me, inside me. It was like it was trying to break through, trying to get out. I finished my route, my nerves completely shattered. I drove back to the depot, parked the truck, and went inside. I didn't even talk to my boss. I just grabbed my things and left. Desperate to escape the knocking, desperate to get away from the truck. I went home and locked myself in my apartment, just like the day before. But this time, it was different. This time, the knocking followed me. I could hear it now, coming from inside my apartment. A soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to be coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor. It was everywhere, all around me, inside me. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I huddled in the corner, my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The knocking was still there, a constant, relentless pulse that echoed in my skull. Tap, tap, tap. It was driving me crazy. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up, ran to the door, and threw it open. The knocking stopped. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, listening to the silence. Then I heard it. A different sound. Pounding. Loud, insistent pounding on the side of the truck, like someone was trapped inside, desperately trying to get out. I froze, a chill running down my spine. I knew what it was. It was the truck. It was calling me. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to get out of there. I had to escape. I turned and ran, out of my apartment, out of the building, out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the other side of the city. I didn't look back. I just kept running, trying to escape the knocking, trying to escape the truck. But I knew deep down that I couldn't escape. It was coming for me. I could feel it. It was just a matter of time. The city lights blurred into streaks of color as I ran, my breath ragged, my lungs burning. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from the knocking, from the truck, from the feeling that something was closing in on me. Every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking presence, every sound a whispered threat. The pounding in my chest echoed the relentless tap, tap, tap that had haunted me all day, a constant reminder of the terror that stalked me. I finally stumbled to a halt in a small park, a patch of green amidst the concrete jungle. The silence here was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the city. I sank onto a bench, my body trembling, my mind reeling. Was I losing my mind? Was this all some elaborate hallucination, a product of stress and exhaustion? I desperately wanted to believe that, to cling to the hope that I could wake up from this nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. This was real. The doppelganger, the knocking, the truck, it was all real. I thought about the diary, the missing driver, the cryptic warnings he'd left behind. I saw someone driving my truck last night. It wasn't me. The words echoed in my mind, a chilling premonition. Had he been replaced? Was that what was happening to me? The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. I stayed in the park for hours, trying to calm my racing heart, trying to make sense of what was happening. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to go back. I had to face whatever was waiting for me. Going back to work was like walking into a lion's den. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to run, to disappear. But I couldn't. I was trapped, caught in a web of fear and dread, compelled to continue down this path of horror. The truck was waiting for me, parked in its usual spot, a silent, menacing presence. As I approached it, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like it was watching me, waiting for me. I climbed into the cab, my hands trembling as I inserted the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, the sound echoing through the empty depot. I pulled out onto the street, my eyes constantly scanning my surroundings, searching for, I didn't even know what. The knocking started again, almost immediately. It was faint at first, a subtle tapping that I almost dismissed as road noise. But it quickly grew louder, more insistent, a rhythmic pulse that resonated through the truck. Tap, 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 tap. It was like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, but with an undercurrent of something frantic, desperate. As I drove my route, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. It was like it was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me about something. But I couldn't decipher the message, only feel the growing sense of unease that it instilled. Then, I reached Pine Street. The name sent a jolt of fear through me. I remembered the diary, the missing driver's cryptic warnings about this street, about house number 237. He'd written about a bad feeling, a sense of dread that had overwhelmed him. He'd never wanted to go back. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the accelerator. Should I skip this street? Should I pretend I hadn't seen it? But I knew I couldn't. I was drawn to it, compelled by a morbid curiosity, a sense of impending doom. I turned onto Pine Street, my heart pounding in my chest. The street was quiet, deserted. The houses stood in silent rows, their windows like vacant eyes staring out into the morning light. Everything about the street felt wrong, out of place. The air was thick with a sense of unease, a feeling that I was being watched. As I drove down the street, I saw it. House number 237. It was an old, dilapidated house, its paint peeling, its windows boarded up. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But there was something about it that made my blood run cold. It was like it was radiating a dark, malevolent energy, a sense of ancient evil. I stopped the truck in front of the house, my hands trembling so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The knocking was deafening now, a constant barrage against the walls of the cab. Tap, tap, tap. It was like the truck was trying to warn me, trying to tell me to get away. I knew I should leave. I knew I should turn around and drive away as fast as I could. But I couldn't. I was trapped, caught in a web of fear and curiosity. I had to know what was inside that house. I climbed out of the truck, my legs feeling like lead. The air was thick with a sense of dread, a feeling that I was walking into a trap. I approached the house cautiously, my boots crunching on the overgrown grass. As I reached the front door, I saw it. A trash bag. It was sitting on the porch, right in front of the door. It was a large, black plastic bag, and it was moving. Not a violent, thrashing movement, but a slow, subtle shifting, like something was alive inside. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew what was in that bag. I knew what I would find if I opened it. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I reached for the bag, my hand trembling. The knocking was deafening now, a constant barrage against my skull. Tap, tap, tap. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the top of the bag. I knew I shouldn't do this. I knew it was a mistake, but the compulsion was too strong. I had to know. I ripped the bag open. Inside the bag, it wasn't what I expected. It was worse. It wasn't a body, not in the way I'd seen before. It was pieces, fragments, Bits and pieces of flesh and bone, mixed with hair and teeth. Hundreds of them. Human teeth, animal teeth, some still embedded in chunks of raw meat. They spilled out of the bag as I ripped it open, a grotesque cascade of gore and decay that splattered onto my hands, onto my clothes, onto the overgrown grass. The smell was overwhelming, a sickening mix of rot and something vaguely metallic, like blood, in a hospital. I recoiled, gagging, the contents of the bag churning in my stomach. The knocking in my head intensified, a deafening roar that threatened to shatter my skull. I stumbled backward, my boots sinking into the soft earth, trying to escape the horrifying scene before me. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was a voice, soft and breathy, coming from behind me. Not yours. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind reeling from the horror I had just witnessed. The whisper hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement that sent shivers down my spine. Not yours. The voice was close, right behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I knew what I would see. I knew that if I turned around, I would come face to face with whatever had whispered those words, and I wasn't sure I could survive the encounter. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath ragged. The silence stretched out, punctuated only by the frantic beating of my heart and the buzzing in my ears. I could feel the presence behind me, a cold, malevolent energy that radiated from the shadows. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. I had to escape. I turned and ran back to the truck, back to the illusion of safety. I didn't look back. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, as fast as my legs could carry me. The image of the teeth, the whisper, burned into my brain. I jumped into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I didn't even bother to empty the rest of the bins on the street. I just put the truck in gear and sped away, leaving the house, the bag, the whisper behind. But the knocking was still there. It followed me, no matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I went. It was like it was a part of the truck itself, a malevolent presence that had taken root inside the metal shell. And now there was something else, the smell, the sickeningly sweet smell of decay and hospital. It clung to me, to the truck, to the air itself. I drove back to the depot, my nerves completely shattered. I parked the truck, my hands still shaking, and ran inside. I didn't even talk to my boss. I just grabbed my things and left, desperate to escape the knocking, desperate to get away from the truck, desperate to wash the smell of death off my skin. I went home and locked myself in my apartment, just like the day before. But this time it was different. This time, the knocking followed me, and so did the smell. I could smell it now, coming from inside my apartment, a faint but unmistakable odor of rot and hospital. It was like the smell had seeped into the walls, into the furniture, into the very air I breathed. I huddled in the corner of my bedroom, my hands over my ears, trying to block out the knocking, trying to block out the smell. But it was no use. They were still there, a constant, relentless presence that haunted me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed, my eyes wide open, staring into the darkness, listening to the knocking, smelling the death. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, that I was slipping into madness. The next morning, I knew I couldn't go back to work. I couldn't face the truck, the knocking, the smell. I called in sick, telling my boss that I was feeling worse. He didn't argue. He just told me to take care of myself. I spent the day in my apartment, a prisoner of my own fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, just on the other side of the wall, waiting for me. The knocking continued, a constant, rhythmic tapping that echoed through my apartment. And the smell grew stronger, more pervasive, filling every corner of my home with the stench of death. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to get out. I had to escape. I packed a bag, throwing in a few clothes, some food, anything I could grab quickly. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from the knocking, from the smell, from the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. As I was leaving my apartment, I heard a noise, a scraping sound coming from the hallway. It was like metal scraping against metal, a low, grinding noise that sent shivers down my spine. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I knew what it was. It was the truck. It had followed me again. I didn't dare open the door. I turned and ran, out the back of my apartment, down the fire escape, into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the other side of the city. I didn't look back. I just kept running, trying to escape the knocking, trying to escape the smell, trying to escape the truck. But I knew, deep down, that I couldn't escape. It was coming for me. I could feel it. It was just a matter of time. The knocking had become a part of me, a constant reminder of the horror that was waiting. And the smell was like a shroud clinging to me, marking me as its own. I knew that whatever it was close. I could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent energy that surrounded me. And I knew that soon, very soon, I would have to face it. I would have to face whatever was making the knocking, whatever was causing the smell, whatever was driving the truck. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I wouldn't survive the encounter. The city sprawled before me, a labyrinth of concrete and steel, indifferent to my terror. I wandered aimlessly, a ghost in my own life, the knocking a relentless echo in my mind, the stench of decay clinging to me like a second skin. Everywhere I went, the feeling of being watched intensified. Eyes seemed to bore into me from the darkness, from the shadows, from the reflections in shop windows. I was hunted, pursued by something unseen, something malevolent. I found myself back in the park where I had sought refuge the previous night. The benches were empty, the playground silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. But even here, in this small oasis of green, I couldn't escape the feeling of dread. The air was thick with anticipation, a sense of impending doom. I sat down on a bench, my body numb, my mind blank. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The knocking was constant now, a deafening roar in my ears. The smell of death was overwhelming, suffocating me. I felt like I was drowning in it, consumed by it. Then I saw it. A trash bag. It was sitting on the edge of the playground near the swings. It was a large, black plastic bag, and it was moving. Not a violent, thrashing movement, but a slow, subtle shifting, like something was alive inside. My heart sank. I knew what was in that bag. I knew what I would find if I opened it. But this time, there was no curiosity, no morbid compulsion. Just a sense of resignation, a feeling that I had reached the end of the line. I walked towards the bag, my legs heavy, my spirit broken. The knocking was deafening now, a constant barrage against my skull. The smell of death was so strong it made me gag. As I reached the bag, I saw something else, a figure. It was standing in the shadows, just beyond the playground. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness, but I knew who it was. It was the doppelganger. It was staring at me, its eyes cold and empty, its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I knew what I had to do. I reached for the bag, my hand trembling. The knocking was deafening now, a constant roar in my ears. The smell of death was overwhelming, suffocating me. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the top of the bag. I knew what I would find inside. I knew what would happen if I opened it. But I had no choice. I was trapped, caught in a web of horror, compelled to play out this macabre ritual. I ripped the bag open. Inside I found him, the missing driver. He was alive, but twisted and broken, his body contorted into unnatural angles. His eyes were wide open, staring up at me with a look of terror and pleading. He was just like the doppelganger I had seen, a grotesque imitation of a human being. As I stared at him, a wave of nausea washed over me. I felt my bones shifting, my body contorting. I was becoming like him. The transformation was quick, brutal. My skin stretched and tightened, my bones snapped and rearranged themselves. My eyes widened, my mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. I became the doppelganger. The knocking stopped. The smell of death faded. I was no longer Michelle. I was something else, something monstrous, something inhuman. I looked at the broken driver, my former self, with cold, empty eyes. I felt no pity, no remorse, just a cold, empty hunger. Then I heard the engine start, the truck. It was idling nearby, waiting for me. I turned and walked towards it, my body moving with an unnatural grace. I climbed into the cab, my movements precise, mechanical. I took the wheel, my hands gripping it tightly. I looked in the side mirror. I saw my reflection, but it wasn't me. It was the doppelganger. It was the missing driver. It was something else. I put the truck in gear and pulled out onto the street. The truck rumbled to life, its engine roaring like a beast unleashed. I drove away, leaving the broken driver behind, just like the others. The cycle continued. The truck drove on. Its driver changed, its cargo grotesque. It moved through the city, collecting its due, enforcing its rules. And somewhere in the shadows, another trash bag shifted, waiting to be opened, waiting for its next victim, waiting for its next driver. The knocking would start again soon.